Richard Glenn Rutan first touched down on planet Earth on July 1st, 1938 in Loma Linda, California. His charmed life began the minute the clock started running. You see, Dick, the eldest, followed by Nellie Ann and finally Bird in 1943, hit a much more valuable jackpot than mere wealth or social prominence. All three began life with that greatest gift of all: they had great parents. George and Irene Rutan ran one of the most successful mom-and-pop operations in aviation history, and that's what they went by, too, Mom and Pop Rutan, who gave the world a beautiful and elegant stewardess, one of the two greatest aircraft designers to ever walk the earth, and in terms of sheer achievements, arguably the greatest pilot that ever lived. Now, like every real American boy, Dick got his pilot's license on his 16th birthday, and seemingly before the ink had dried, he found himself exactly where he belonged, in the front seat of the best jets of the most powerful Air Force the world has ever seen. He left his younger brother behind to build model airplanes in order to impress his lifelong hero, who was no longer there to see them. But he would see what those model airplanes would eventually become, and one day, he'd fly one of his kid brother Bert's toy airplanes all the way around the by God planet. Dick started his flying career in the backseat of an F-101B Voodoo. That's more of an interceptor than a fighter, really. He did the same in the F-89 Scorpion for a while, and then served as the in-flight navigator aboard a Douglas C-124 Globemaster II, a big, tough, slow propeller airplane. And this experience would come in handy when he would fly a small, fragile, and slow propeller airplane many years later. But then Dick Rutan got to move to the position that every pilot covets, whether they care to admit it or not. That would be the front and only seat in a fighter jet. In Rutan's case, it happened to be the F-100 Super Sabre, and if you were a swinging space-age steely-eyed missile man like Dick Rutan, you had your choice of some pretty cool rides. But to many of us, the F-100, the Hun, was by far the coolest of them all. Seeing the Thunderbirds flying the F-100 Super Sabre made you believe it was possible for a good old-fashioned American muscle car to actually fly. Why don't you come with me, little girl, on a magic carpet ride? Well, you don't know what we can see. Why don't you tell your dreams to me? Fantasy will set you free. Dick Rutan would fly 325 combat missions over Vietnam. The first 220 of them were something of a blur, an endless series of ground attack missions. I spent those first few months turning jungle into toothpicks and making monkeys go deaf, he would later recall. It was one hell of a way to fight a war. But then, Dick Rutan heard about a special unit that was forming. These Hun drivers would be doing something different, and they'd be doing something differently. Given the extent and density of the ground cover in Southeast Asia, hiding enemy troops was easier than during any other war in U.S. history. Now that made the job of the FACs, or forward air controllers, even more essential than ever before. You see, the problem wasn't destroying enemy targets. The problem was finding them. Now, they started with the Douglas A-1 Skyraider, the last propeller-driven combat aircraft in the United States inventory, which had good slow-flying capabilities and excellent duration over the target. Pilots and ground crews referred to the A-1 as the SPAD, after the World War I French-built fighter plane. But enemy air defenses grew more and more sophisticated, and the single-engine Spads were getting blasted out of the sky. The dense jungle canopy of Vietnam could hide all manner of anti-aircraft guns, not to mention surface-to-air missiles, but someone, flying something, would have to get over enemy positions, mark the elusive and devilishly hard-to-find targets, and then stay there until other fast movers could come in and hit the targets. That someone would become, by war's end, 157 highly skilled, all-volunteer pilots. The something would be the fast and rugged Hun, and together they would invent an entirely new way of delivering pain to the troops, truck drivers, and gunners right at the choke point on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. These were no longer facts, forward air controllers. These were fast facts. They'd come in thundering low and fast, damn near supersonic. Their call sign would be Misty. And as the 40th pilot to join this experiment in mayhem for the final 105 missions he flew in Vietnam, Dick Rutan became and would ever remain Misty 40.
Get your motor running, head out on the highway, looking for adventure, and whatever comes our way. Yeah, darling, go make it happen. Take the world in a loving embrace. Fire all of the guns at once and explode into space. I like smoking lightning.
Rutan loved flying for the Misties. In America's worst-fought war, they were serious, professional warriors whose hands had finally been untied from behind their backs and who were ready to get down to some serious business. "I came here to win the war," Dick said, and these guys were here for the same reason. It was grueling work, very dangerous and very different than what Rutan had been doing before. You see, on a regular strike mission, you'd take off, fly to the target, drop 6 500-pound Mark 82s on the bad guys, then turn around and go home. That would count as one mission. But the Misties, however, would proceed to the target area, put white phosphorus rockets onto the target, wait until a strike package would come in and the secondary explosions finally subsided, then go find a KC-135 tanker, top her off, then head back and do it again. And again. And again. All on the same day. A Misty mission could be 5 or 6 hours long. By any reasonable definition, that single Misty sortie would come to about the same amount of flying as 4 or 5 regular strike missions in a single day. Dick Rutan's 105 Misty missions entailed about as much flying as 400 strike missions, and because their entire purpose was to loiter where the anti-aircraft fire was the heaviest, they were by far the most dangerous flights of the Vietnam War. Now, this required a certain kind of mindset. "If someone was stupid enough to shoot at Dick Rutan," said Dick Rutan, "then I'd go back and kill them." And the North Vietnamese weren't just shooting a lot of machine guns at them, although they did shoot a lot of machine guns at them. They would also go after them with 37mm and 57mm anti-aircraft artillery shells, essentially a miniature howitzer, and one round of those would usually do the trick. When those AAA rounds came close enough, Dick said, the shock waves from the individual shells that would narrowly miss sounded like dozens of Major League batters swinging for the fences against the bottom of the airplane. And if a gun sight fired at me, well, then that gun sight had to die, he said, which seems simple enough, really. In the hands of a sufficiently motivated pilot, the 4 20mm cannons arrayed in a neat line below the Hun's beautiful oval intake pumped out a stream of rounds that were damn near as big as the shells the NVA were shooting up at them. The Misty pilots also specialized in SAR, or search and rescue missions. If an American got shot down and parachuted into that thick canopy, more often than not it would be a Misty pilot who saw where they went in. They'd orbit to draw fire away from the incoming rescue helicopters, and if they were in radio contact with the downed pilot and knew his exact position, well, they might rough up any bad guys in the neighborhood that were heading that way. Our air crews understood that if an American pilot went down over enemy territory, the full might and resources of the United States of America would be deployed to get that airman back no matter what, even if they were from the Navy. Of the 157 Misty pilots that flew these missions, 34 of them, that's 22%, would be shot down, and 2 Misty pilots were shot down twice. 7 would be killed in action, and 4 of them would become POWs. Now, one of those 34 pilots to be shot down was Misty 40. He was in the front seat for his 105th and final Misty mission. He was lower than normal and back at his favorite hobby, which was blowing up North Vietnamese supply trucks making their way down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now, coming out of a pass, there was a huge bang, and the Hun shuddered as if it had been swatted by a giant hand. "We're in trouble," yelled Chuck Shaheen, that'd be Misty 52, from the back seat. Dick immediately climbed and turned for the coast. He could see the water shining in the distance. You see, America owned the water and the communists owned the jungle, and both Dick and Chuck could also see that at the speed they were flying and at the rate they were bleeding fuel, they were going to run out of gas before they ran out of jungle.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend, the end.
Now that meant there was only one option left. Look, if you're going to lose fuel from an airplane, you might as well squirt it into the jet's afterburner and accelerate as much as possible, and as luck would have it, that shot-up afterburner did not explode, and the Hun did what the Hun did best, which is go fast in a straight line. Not long before the fuel gauge read 0, and while still over land, Dick felt himself suddenly relax. He later said it wasn't just calm, he was practically euphoric. They had enough airspeed and altitude to make it well offshore, and rescue helicopters were already on the way. Then the engine flamed out, and that was just fine with Dick Rutan, because as he rode that trusty Hun down and out to their best ejection point, Dick realized that his war was over. For his actions flying Misty missions, he had been awarded the Silver Star. Dick Rutan would also be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. That's a rare honor bestowed on such aviation legends as the Wright brothers, Charles Lindbergh, Jimmy Doolittle, Chuck Yeager, Mercury astronauts Alan Shepard and John Glenn, 5 of the Apollo moonwalkers, and U.S. President George H.W. Bush. Dick Rutan, however, would be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross 5 times. But none of that mattered much, as Chuck Shaheen and Dick Rutan both reached for the loud handle and then took a brief swim in the warm waters of the Gulf of Tonkin until being picked up by a rescue helicopter and flown back to base. Dick had flown 325 combat missions over Vietnam. He'd been at the bleeding edge of the spear, and he made it through. And as soon as he realized that he had survived Vietnam, he lay down on the floor of that helicopter and fell dead asleep.
Desperately in need of some stranger's hand in a desperate land.
Okay, here's a riddle for you. A man leaves town on a Sunday, heading west. He travels west for 2 Mondays, but only 1 Thursday. And he is still traveling west when he returns home to the place he started from. So how did he do it? You give up? Okay, well, the answer is he did it by being Dick Rutan. Now, life's not easy when you have the kind of spirit that Dick Rutan was both gifted and plagued with. Those legendary aviators who had made their names immortal had done it not by merely breaking records, but by setting milestones, and there is a difference. For example, Charles Lindbergh became the most famous man in the world when he flew the first solo, non-stop flight from New York to Paris on May 20th through the 21st of 1927. Now that was a milestone. His aircraft, the Spirit of St. Louis, cruised a little over 100 miles an hour, and his flight took 33 and a half hours. Now, since then, hundreds of millions of people have broken his record. We fly from New York to Paris today in a bit over 7 hours at a speed of 550 miles per hour, but you can't take away Lindbergh's milestone. That's forever. But by the early 1980s, all of the milestones had been reached. Take, for example, the all-time altitude record. Considering men had landed on the moon by then, The Apollo astronauts had not only set the all-time altitude record, the 25,000 miles per hour needed to get there and back made them the fastest men alive as well. But there was one left. No one, not ever, had ever flown around the world all the way without stopping and without refueling. So there it sat, the last milestone, staring right at Dick Rutan, mocking him. No one had done it because it wasn't possible to do. But as it turned out, all that Dick Rutan really had to do to get that last great milestone in aviation was to be the older brother of the greatest aircraft design genius in the world. Once he'd pulled that off, the rest of it was practically inevitable. The idea to make that last milestone flight around the world non-stop and unrefueled began, as all great ideas do, on the back of a napkin. Burt Rutan sketched out the basics for what would become his 76th aircraft design. Amazingly, that back of a napkin sketch was a near-perfect rendition of the final design. A woman named Jenna Yeager would be making the flight with Dick. She'd been a spark plug that had helped keep the project moving, but Jenna Yeager was not a natural pilot, and she had trouble learning the aircraft systems. So, as it turned out, Dick would have to fly the notoriously unstable aircraft, they called it Voyager, for 9 days with nothing more than 15-minute cat naps every now and then when the air was smooth enough for the autopilot. 9 days. Now, in the initial tests with a minimum fuel load, Voyager was sluggish but flyable. But as the flight tests continued and Voyager flew with more and more fuel, some serious issues developed. The more fuel they loaded aboard Voyager, the worse the flying qualities became. Dick would put Voyager into a 20-degree bank and it wouldn't turn. Now, this didn't make Dick particularly happy, and that in turn led to a perfect storm conflict between two sets of natural rivals in the animal kingdom, and that would be design engineers versus test pilots, in this case, turbocharged by good old-fashioned sibling rivalry. Burt said, "Dick, your damn rudders are too small." "Wait, you knew that for this to work would result in minimal controllable flight characteristics," replied his little brother. "God damn it, Burt, the plane won't turn," Dick thundered. "Dick," Burt replied calmly, "this is an around-the-world flight. The airplane doesn't have to turn at all." And just before 8 a.m. on the morning of December 14, 1986, Dick Rutan aimed the Voyager down the longest paved runway in the free world at Edwards Air Force Base and began what was the longest takeoff roll in aviation history. Jenna was calling out the airspeed as Voyager waddled down the runway, fully loaded with fuel for the first time ever. 20 knots, she said. 25. Now, Dick couldn't see it, but with a full fuel load, Voyager was for the first time dragging its wingtips along the runway, and that friction was holding it back. 45 knots, said Jenna. 50 knots. It was later discovered that the additional weight of this first and only full fuel takeoff had twisted the leading edge of the wing down so much that it was impossible for Voyager to get off the ground. And then a miracle occurred. It was a miracle that our friend Dick Rutan described with the gentle humility that all of us who knew him recognized in an instant. "You see this right here," he would later say, pointing to his side. "This is the velvet arm. It is without equal in the universe." Somehow, in a way inconceivable to the rest of the mere mortals joining us here today, that steely-eyed missile man managed to massage the flight controls just enough to flap those dragging wingtips off the runway and get her in the air, and then somehow, he managed to keep her in the air, because anyone who watched Voyager depart that morning could see that the only thing that was making that aircraft gain altitude as it headed west was the curvature of the Earth. For several days, until it had burned off some fuel, Voyager could hardly be said to be controllable at all. The slightest turbulence would cause the wings to oscillate, literally flapping up and down like the world's heaviest goose trying to get off the surface of a lake. And this oscillation, if not corrected within about 15 seconds, would simply tear the wings off the airplane. So for the first 3 days, nothing but the velvet arm could manage to gently dampen out that potentially fatal runaway feedback loop. So, Dick Rutan did what he had to do. He flew for 3 days by hand without a moment's rest. Voyager had crossed the Pacific Ocean and had passed the Philippines before it felt stable enough to set the autopilot for a 10-minute catnap. And there were other worries as well, because in 1986 the Cold War was still very hot. As we approached Vietnam, I had a lot of thoughts dancing in my head, Dick would later write. Chief among them was whether they would shoot me down again. The days droned on, and as they started to cross Africa, Dick could feel his mind shutting down from sleep deprivation. It was like that scene in 2001, A Space Odyssey, where they shut down HAL, he explained. I could feel my mental system shutting down one by one. I could see the instruments, but I didn't have the slightest idea of what they were there for. Hell, I held my own hand up in front of my face, and I couldn't remember what it was there for. As they were crossing Africa, Mission Control told Dick that he was about 3 hours away from a dormant volcano called Mount Cameroon. Halfway between Voyager and Mount Cameroon, about 90 minutes ahead, was a checkpoint called Yankee Delta. Jenna managed to talk Dick out of the seat to get some rest. The air was calm, plane was manageable at last, and the autopilot seemed to be doing just fine. Wake me when we get to Yankee Delta, Dick told Jenna. You understand? Wake me at Yankee Delta. Jenna told him she got the message, so Dick climbed out of the pilot's seat and stretched out as best he could. He was instantly asleep. I woke up what felt like a minute later, he said. He was running a cold sweat. Are we at Yankee Delta yet, he asked. Oh, that, replied Jenna. No, we passed that a long time ago. Dick leapt forward. The radar showed Mount Cameroon about a mile directly ahead. He didn't have time to get to the controls. Turn, 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 he started shouting, and Jenna turned the heading indicator on the autopilot. Dick estimates that they came within a mile of the face of Mount Cameroon. If he'd slept for 1 minute longer, they both would have been killed instantly. They never would have known what hit him. And then Voyager plowed past the west coast of Africa and headed out across the Atlantic. On the morning of December 23, 1986, Burt Rutan and the irreplaceable Mike Melville headed out in the pre-dawn darkness and flew south towards San Diego. Just a few hours earlier, they'd gotten the call that Voyager still had at least 28 gallons remaining, and that meant that they could make it home to Edwards Air Force Base. As Burt and Mike flew south in the pre-dawn darkness, way off in the distant gloom, they could see the faint flash of an aircraft strobe. Was it them? It was very far away. Dick, said Burt on the radio, can you turn off your strobe for a few seconds, then turn it back on again? And then, off in the murky distance, the flashing white light disappeared for a few seconds. And when it came back on again, Burt Rutan and Mike Melville suddenly started crying. Sobbing, actually. They couldn't read the instruments through their tears. There they were, exclaimed Burt. Right there. As Voyager approached Edwards, Dick had one last thing to worry about. Would Edwards Air Force Base let them land? They didn't have clearance through the restricted airspace around the base, and Edwards was a constant hotbed of activity. What if they denied him permission to land? So Dick keyed his mic. Edwards Tower, this is Voyager 1. Sir, we were wondering if you could kind of sneak us in between your normal traffic. We can stay out of your way on the way in. Voyager 1, this is Edwards Tower. We've been expecting you and have canceled all flight activities for the day. There are 50,000 people here waiting for you, Voyager 1. You are cleared to land. Welcome home. Despite having flown for what would officially be recorded as 9 days, 3 minutes, and 44 seconds, Dick Rutan still managed to get in a final low-level beauty pass for the waiting crowds. And when Voyager finally taxied to a stop, Dick pulled himself out of the cockpit and sat on the fuselage on the top of the airplane. Somebody handed him his cowboy hat. He put it on, and then he sat there for a while trying to look nonchalant as if to say, yeah, just kind of flew this baby around the world, no big deal. But the real reason he sat there for so long was because he couldn't feel his legs. And he didn't want to collapse to the ground in front of all of those well-wishers and TV cameras from around the world. He didn't think that would look good for America. Dick Rutan had just landed after flying around the world exactly the way he had visualized it so many times before during those 5 endless years of frustrations, meetings, broken promises, all of that needed to get the money, to build the plane, and then fund the flight. Felt even better when I did it for real, he said with a grin. After Voyager, there were still a few lesser aviation firsts left to be achieved. One of them was the idea of the first balloon flight around the world. Dick got his balloon license in 1995, he found a sponsor, and in January of 1998 he launched aboard the helium-filled Global Hilton with co-pilot Dave Melton, attempting to recreate in a very general way his 26,366-mile flight aboard Voyager. And he fell only 26,266 miles short of that goal when a manufacturing defect caused a helium cell to rupture at 30,000 feet. He and Dave Melton rode the crippled balloon down to about 6,000 feet, where both parachuted to safety about 100 miles from their starting point. Now, counting a malfunction in an F-4 Phantom over England in his years after Vietnam, that marked the third and final time that Dick Rutan had to hit the silk in order to save his life.
Goddamn cactus is what got me.
In May of 2000, he got a last-minute invitation to fly to the North Pole aboard the biggest biplane ever built, the Soviet Antonov AN-2. Now, they made a lovely landing on the ice using the aircraft's skids, and as soon as they'd come to a complete stop, they discovered that they had not come to a complete stop. The ice that they had landed on was abnormally thin, and the huge biplane started to sink. Dick got it all on videotape. Thought it was pretty cool until he realized that he and several other people were standing at the North Pole without shelter or a means of leaving, so they made themselves an igloo and all were eventually picked up and rescued without any serious harm. The very next year, in 2001, Dick Rutan became the chief test pilot for X-Corps Aerospace, a Mojave Airport-based startup that had plans to build their own 2-person suborbital vehicle called the Lynx. Now, as a test bed, X-Corps had attached a couple of rocket motors to the back of the old, familiar Long Easy, Bert's most popular design, and an aircraft that Dick had been flying for years. They called it the Easy Rocket. On one test, Dick was strapped in and ready to go when he realized that he had mounted up before they'd had a chance to test the engines prior to takeoff. Now, the Long Easy is a tight fit even without the parachute, so Dick decided to break his own ironclad safety rule and told them to just go ahead and perform the engine test while he was still aboard. Now, one of the 2 engines lit just fine, but unfortunately, it would not shut down. That meant that just a foot behind Dick's head was a rocket plume nearly 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit that would cut him in half like an acetylene torch. Now, just off to the side, Dick could see engineers looking at him in wide-eyed, open-mouthed amazement. 1 or 2 of them seemed to have a bright orange reflection in their glasses, and the color matched the bright flickering orange light that was reflected inside the canopy. They were supposed to be walking towards me, but instead they were backing away, Dick later explained, and that's when I realized that there was a huge puddle of kerosene burning underneath the vehicle and, very likely, a liquid oxygen leak that would turn that kerosene into a small Chernobyl. So, Dick unbuckled his harness, hopped out of the Easy Rocket, and then proceeded to set yet another record, this time for the fastest speed ever recorded in the 50-yard dash. I looked back at the fire burning underneath the fuel and LOX tanks, and I decided I'd probably better add another 50 yards, Dick added. Now, Dick Rutan did use the Easy Rocket to set one final milestone when he flew a mail packet from Mojave to nearby California City Airport exactly 10 miles away. It will likely remain the shortest long-distance flight by a rocket-powered airplane for the rest of human history. Now, it may not have been a long flight, but at least it was really, really loud. The kind of private flying that so many of us do is generally very safe, but Dick Rutan was not one of those pilots. Men like Dick have their own language and superstitions and traditions to help them deal with the emotional stress of strapping in and heading up to do something extraordinarily dangerous on a regular basis. Test pilots never crash, you see. They auger in, and if they put a crater in a cornfield, his friends would say, well, he was a decent fellow, so he ended up buying the farm. Now, making a fatal mistake, the kind that humans make, well, that was about as dumb as sneaking into your teen girlfriend's house in total darkness, opening the wrong bedroom door, and you'd end up screwing the pooch. Likewise, airmen never die. They simply wait for golden hour, they hop in their favorite dream machine, and fly west into the sunset. Now, for regular pilots like the rest of us, flying west evokes a gentle, serene slide towards that golden horizon, probably in a Piper Cub or something like that. Our friend Dick Rutan has flown west, but he did not go gentle into that good night, not Dick. When Dick Rutan flew west at about 7:15 p.m. on May 3rd, 2024, he didn't go out in a Piper Cub. Dick Rutan flew west like this.